It was supposed to be a simple night drive. I had done it 100 times before leave the city after work, head down the highway, and be at my parents' house in the countryside by midnight. The road was long and winding, cutting through vast stretches of forest and farmland, but I always found the drive peaceful. That night, though, something felt off from the start. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, just a sense of unease that settled in my chest as soon as I merged onto the highway. The sky was clear, and the moon hung low, casting long shadows across the road. I turned up the radio to drown out the eerie quiet of the night, but it didn't help. The music felt hollow, distant, like it was coming from another world. After about an hour, I was deep into the countryside. The road was empty, not another car in sight, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches reaching toward me like skeletal fingers. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. But then, in the distance, I saw someone standing at the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the moon, but as I got closer, I realized it was a figure. A man, dressed in dark clothes, standing perfectly still on the shoulder, staring straight ahead. I slowed down as I passed him, trying to make out his features, but his face was hidden in shadow. He didn't move, didn't react to my car passing by. He just stood there, like a statue. I kept driving, trying to shake off the image of the man, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him receding into the distance, but the road behind me was empty. He was gone. I told myself I was just tired, that I hadn't really seen anything out of the ordinary. But then, about 10 minutes later, I saw him again. The same man, standing at the side of the road, the same eerie stillness. This time, I was sure of it. It was the same person, but how could he have gotten ahead of me? There were no turnoffs, no shortcuts, just the long, straight stretch of highway. A chill ran down my spine as I drove past him again. I resisted the urge to stop, to ask if he needed help, because something deep in my gut told me not to. Something about him wasn't right. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look in the rearview mirror this time. I didn't want to know if he was still there. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees on either side looming larger, their shadows growing darker. The air in the car felt thick, heavy, like I was driving through water. I tried to focus on my breathing, on keeping my hands steady on the wheel, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure on the road. And then, I saw him again. This time, he was standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt as the car came to a halt just feet from where he stood. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He was closer now, close enough that I could make out his face. It was pale, and naturally so, like all the blood had drained from his skin. His eyes were dark, hollow, and he was staring directly at me, but he didn't move. He just stood there, blocking my way, his gaze locked on mine. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just sit there, but I couldn't drive forward either, not with him standing in the way. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, and I felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to get as far away from this man as possible. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. One moment he was there, and the next, the road was empty again. I sat there for a moment, stunned, before slowly pressing down on the gas and driving forward. I didn't see him again for the rest of the drive, but the feeling of unease stayed with me, lingering like a dark cloud over my head. When I finally pulled into my parents' driveway, I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I was safe. But the memory of that man, of his hollow eyes and eerie stillness, stayed with me long after I had stepped inside, locking the door behind me. I never drove that road at night again. It was a late autumn night, the kind where the chill seeps into your bones and the darkness feels thicker than usual. I had finished work late and decided to drive the 2 hours to my parents' house rather than wait until the next morning. The road was familiar to me, a long, winding stretch of rural highway that cut through miles of dense forest. I'd driven it countless times, but that night, something felt different. The clock on my dashboard read 11:45 p.m. as I merged onto the empty highway. The trees towered on either side of the road, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I turned on the radio to distract myself from the eerie silence, but all I could pick up was static. No music, no talk shows, just the low hum of white noise filling the car. I turned it off, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of my engine, The first half hour passed uneventfully, and I tried to settle into the drive. But as I rounded a curve, something caught my eye, a figure standing at the edge of the road. I instinctively slowed down, squinting to make out the shape. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress that seemed too thin for the cold night air. She stood motionless, her back to me, just on the edge of the pavement. My heart skipped a beat. What was she doing out here in the middle of nowhere, alone at this hour? I debated stopping to ask if she needed help, but something in the pit of my stomach told me to keep driving. As I passed her, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. She was still standing there, her figure slowly disappearing into the distance. I shook my head, trying to brush off the encounter as just one of those strange, unsettling things you see on the road at night. But 10 minutes later, I saw her again. This time, she was standing on the opposite side of the road, facing me. My heart began to race as I slowed the car. It was impossible. There were no turnoffs, no intersections, nothing but this endless stretch of highway. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me, but there she was, her pale face illuminated by my headlights. I couldn't see her eyes, just dark shadows where they should have been. The pit in my stomach grew heavier. I sped up, driving past her quickly, but my hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, refusing to look in the rearview mirror this time. I just wanted to get to my parents' house, get off this cursed road. For the next 20 minutes, I didn't see her again. I started to relax, convincing myself that it had been some sort of strange hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But just as I began to let my guard down, she appeared again. This time, she was standing directly in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop just feet from her. She was staring straight at me, her eyes dark and hollow, her face expressionless. My breath caught in my throat as I sat there frozen, unable to move or look away. Her presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at her, but then, without warning, she was gone. One moment she was standing in front of my car, and the next, the road was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a shaky breath and slowly pressed down on the gas, my eyes darting around in case she reappeared. I drove the rest of the way in a daze. The image of her face burned into my mind. When I finally pulled into my parents' driveway, it felt like I had been holding my breath for the entire drive. I quickly got out of the car and rushed inside, locking the door behind me as if it could somehow keep the strange figure away. I didn't tell my parents what I saw. I didn't even really know how to explain it. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, somewhere on that lonely stretch of highway, waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to come along. I never took that road again. It was around 2 a.m., and the highway was eerily quiet as I made my way home from a long day at work. The road was familiar, Route 47, a 2-lane stretch cutting through the dense woods of rural Pennsylvania. I'd driven it 1,000 times, but something about this night felt different. The moon hung low, casting a pale glow on the trees that lined the road. Shadows stretched across the asphalt, playing tricks on my eyes as I drove deeper into the wilderness. The radio, my only company, had begun to fade in and out, leaving me with nothing but static. I tried to switch stations, but all I got was more static. Strange, usually, I could pick up a signal out here, even if it was just some old country station. But tonight, nothing. A sense of unease crept over me, but I brushed it off. It was late, I was tired, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. I rolled down the window, hoping the cool night air would clear my head, but instead, it just made me feel more exposed. The wind carried a strange scent, damp earth mixed with something metallic, almost like blood. I shook my head, trying to focus on the road ahead. That's when I saw a flicker of movement on the shoulder up ahead. I slowed down, squinting into the darkness. It looked like a person, standing just off the road, barely visible in the moonlight. As I approached, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, wearing a white dress that looked unnaturally bright against the dark trees behind her. She was standing perfectly still, her back to the road, facing the forest. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be out here at this hour, and why? I pulled over instinctively, rolling the window down just enough to call out to her. "Hey, are you okay?" My voice sounded shaky, even to me. She didn't respond. She didn't move at all. Just stood there, staring into the woods. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Something about this wasn't right. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but I couldn't just drive off. What if she needed help? I unbuckled my seatbelt, but before I could get out, she finally moved. Slowly, she turned her head towards me. The movement was deliberate, almost mechanical. When her face came into view, I gasped. Her eyes were wide and vacant, like she wasn't really seeing me at all. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were twisted into a strange half-smile that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't say anything, just stared at me with that unnerving expression. My hand hovered over the gear shift, ready to drive away, but I couldn't look away from her. It was like I was trapped in her gaze, frozen in place. Suddenly, she raised her arm and pointed towards the woods. Her finger trembled as she gestured, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper carried on the wind, though I couldn't make out the words. I turned to look where she was pointing, but all I could see were trees and shadows. When I turned back, she was gone, vanished. Not a trace of her remained. My heart pounded in my chest as I frantically scanned the area. There was no way she could have just disappeared like that. I hadn't even blinked. Without thinking, I slammed the car into gear and sped off, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the road behind me, but there was nothing. Just the empty highway stretching out into the night. I drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, until I saw the familiar lights of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in, parked under the bright fluorescence, and sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. After a few deep breaths, I decided to go inside, maybe grab a coffee to calm my nerves. The clerk behind the counter gave me a curious look as I walked in, probably noticing how shaken I looked. "All right, man?" he asked, his voice casual, but with a hint of concern. I hesitated, not sure how to explain what had just happened. "Yeah," I finally said. "Just saw something weird out there on Route 47. A woman, I think." But she disappeared. The clerk's expression changed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You sure about that? You're not the first person to say they've seen something strange out there." "What do you mean?" I asked, my pulse quickening again. He leaned over the counter, lowering his voice. "They say a woman died on that road years ago. Car accident. Folks around here say she still haunts the highway, looking for someone to help her." I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't want to believe it, but after what I'd just seen, I wasn't so sure anymore. I left the gas station, the clerk's words echoing in my mind. As I continued my drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone on that road. And every now and then, when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see her face staring back at me. It was a late Friday night, and I was driving back home after visiting a friend in a small town a few hours away. The road was a familiar one, a long stretch of two-lane highway that cut through miles of dense forest. I had driven it many times before, but something about that night felt off. The darkness was thicker than usual, swallowing the light from my headlights as I sped down the empty road. My phone had lost signal an hour ago, and the silence inside the car was oppressive. I turned on the radio for some company, but all I could pick up was static. I left it on low, a soft hum in the background to break the eerie quiet. As I rounded a curve, I noticed something up ahead on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a car, parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I slowed down, instinctively scanning the area for any sign of movement, but there was no one in sight. I pulled over a few yards ahead, debating whether or not to help. It was late, and I didn't want to get involved in something that could be dangerous, but the idea of leaving someone stranded out here alone didn't sit right with me. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The air was cold, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked towards the car. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, nervous bursts. The car looked old, a beat-up sedan with a flat tire, but there were no signs of a struggle or anything out of the ordinary. Still, something felt wrong. I shined my flashlight into the front seat, half expecting to see someone slumped over the wheel, but the car was empty. My stomach knotted as I took a step back, scanning the woods around me. The beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, but I could see nothing beyond the trees. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky in the stillness. No answer. I swallowed hard, my skin prickling with unease. Whoever had been in the car was gone, and the thought of them being somewhere in the woods, watching me, made my skin crawl. I turned to head back to my car when I heard a faint sound coming from the trees. It was a soft rustling, like someone moving through the underbrush. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the woods again. Is someone there? I called out, my voice louder this time. The rustling stopped. I waited, my heart pounding in my ears, but the silence stretched on, heavy and unnatural. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and hurried back to my car, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for the keys, but when I finally turned the ignition, the car roared to life. Relief flooded through me as I pulled back onto the road, the flashing hazards of the abandoned car fading into the distance behind me. For the next few miles, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but the road remained empty. I turned off the radio, the static too unnerving, and drove in silence, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Eventually, the lights of a small town appeared on the horizon, and the tightness in my chest began to ease. I pulled into a gas station at the edge of town, needing a moment to collect myself. As I stepped out of the car, I looked back down the road, half expecting to see the dark shape of the car I had passed, but there was nothing. Inside the gas station, the clerk greeted me with a friendly smile, and the normalcy of it all was almost jarring. I grabbed the coffee and tried to shake off the lingering unease, but it clung to me like a shadow. When I finally got back on the road, I couldn't stop thinking about the car. Where had the driver gone? Why hadn't they come back to the road when I called out? And what was that noise I had heard in the woods? I never got answers to those questions, and I never took that highway alone at night again. Something was out there in the dark that night, something that didn't want to be seen, and I was just grateful that whatever it was let me go. I had always loved the serenity of night drives. The quiet hum of the engine, the empty roads, the cool night air rushing through the open window, there was something peaceful about being alone on the road. But that night, as I made my way down the winding back roads of rural Pennsylvania, the tranquility I usually cherished was replaced by an unsettling sense of unease. It was a route I'd driven dozens of times before, a shortcut through dense woods that cut about 30 minutes off my commute home. The road was narrow, with sharp bends and thick trees on either side. There were no streetlights out here, just the beams of my headlights carving a path through the darkness. The sky was moonless, the kind of black that felt almost suffocating. As I drove, I noticed something odd. The radio, which I usually kept on to fill the silence, began to cut in and out. Static crackled through the speakers, interrupting the music. I reached out to adjust the dial, but no matter which station I tried, all I got was more static. Annoyed, I turned it off completely, leaving only the sound of the tires rolling over the asphalt. That's when I saw a flash of white in my peripheral vision. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding as I peered into the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. But then, slowly, something began to take shape. On the side of the road, just beyond the reach of my headlights, stood a figure. At first, it was hard to make out, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a woman. She was wearing a long, flowing dress that seemed almost to glow in the dark. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders, and she stood perfectly still, facing the road. I blinked, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. But she didn't disappear. She just stood there, unmoving, watching me. I rolled down the window, hesitating before calling out, "Hey, are you alright?" No response. She didn't even flinch. I glanced around, half expecting someone else to appear from the woods, but we were alone. A creeping dread settled in my chest. Something wasn't right. I pulled over to the side of the road, still keeping my distance from her. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe she was lost, or hurt, or worse. But there was something about her stillness that made my skin crawl. It wasn't natural. I unbuckled my seatbelt, ready to step out and offer help. But just as my hand reached for the door handle, she moved. Not towards me, but away back into the trees. It was a slow, deliberate movement, almost like she was gliding rather than walking. A rational part of me wanted to follow, to make sure she was okay. But every instinct screamed at me to stay in the car. The woods were dense and unforgiving, and the last thing I wanted was to get lost in the dark. Instead, I stayed in the car and watched as she disappeared into the forest, swallowed by the shadows. I waited for a moment, expecting her to reappear, but she didn't. The night was quiet again, eerily so. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still racing. Maybe she was just some lost hiker, or maybe I had imagined the whole thing. The fatigue of a long day, the isolation of the road, the tricks the darkness could play on the mind, it all seemed plausible. I put the car in drive, eager to get home. As I pulled back onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road, but there was nothing. Just the empty stretch of asphalt behind me. The drive felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every rustle in the trees sounded like footsteps. I kept the windows up, the doors locked, and my eyes glued to the road ahead. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The familiar sight of my house brought a sense of relief, but that unease still lingered in the back of my mind. Even as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the image of the woman in white, standing silently on the side of the road, watching me. I never took that shortcut again. Whatever or whoever I had seen that night wasn't something I wanted to encounter a second time. I never thought a late-night drive could be anything more than peaceful, a chance to unwind after a long day. I love the quiet, the empty roads, the way the world seemed to stand still. But this particular night was different, and what I experienced still gives me chills every time I think about it. It was a Friday evening, and I was driving home from a friend's house. The clock on the dashboard read 11:43 p.m., and I had about an hour left on my drive. The sky was pitch black, with no moon in sight, and the two-lane road stretched out in front of me like a ribbon of darkness. Trees lined both sides of the road, their branches hanging low and casting eerie shadows on the pavement. The occasional streetlight flickered as I passed, but for the most part, it was just me and the darkness. I had taken this route countless times before. It was a shortcut through the rural countryside that saved me a good 20 minutes, but it was also isolated. No houses, no gas stations, just miles of road cutting through the woods. Normally, that didn't bother me. In fact, I kind of enjoyed it. But tonight, there was something off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned down the radio to listen to the sounds around me. The road was quiet, too quiet. No crickets chirping, no rustling leaves. Just the steady hum of my car's engine. I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, my eyes darting from the road to the shadows in the trees. And then, out of nowhere, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as my car screeched to a halt. The figure was illuminated by my headlights, and for a moment, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She was standing perfectly still, her face turned towards the woods. I stared at her, trying to make sense of the situation. What was she doing out here, alone, in the middle of nowhere? Was she lost, hurt? I rolled down my window, the cool night air rushing in as I called out to her. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She didn't even move. She just stood there, her back to me, staring into the trees. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something about this wasn't right. I considered getting out of the car to check on her, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put. There was something unnatural about her stillness, something that made my skin crawl. I kept my eyes locked on her, waiting for her to move, to speak, to do anything. But she didn't. And then, without warning, she turned around. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes. Her eyes were completely black, not just dark, but voids of pure blackness, like two empty sockets staring right through me. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was frozen in place, trapped in her gaze. And then, she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, or a friendly one. It was a twisted, sinister grin that sent a jolt of terror through my body. I felt a sudden urge to drive, to get as far away from her as possible. My hands shook as I fumbled for the gear shift, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I put the car in drive, she took a step towards me. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as I sped away. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing in the road, but there was nothing. The road was empty, and the trees loomed over me like silent sentinels. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main highway. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me, that somehow she had followed me. I kept checking my mirrors, my pulse racing with every shadow I saw. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. The familiar sight of my house brought some comfort, But the image of that woman, those black eyes, and that twisted smile was burned into my mind. I never told anyone about what happened that night. It sounds ridiculous, like something out of a horror movie, but I know what I saw. I know it was real. And I know I'll never take that shortcut again. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and dark, I still feel like she's out there, waiting, watching. Driving at night was never something that scared me. In fact, I always found it calming, the hum of the engine, the empty roads, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just the length of my headlights. But this night was different. It was late, maybe around midnight, and I was heading back home from a friend's place after a small get-together. The route was familiar, just a straight shot down a rural highway that cut through the woods. The kind of road that always felt eerily quiet but had never bothered me before. The night was unusually dark. No moon, no stars, just an inky blackness swallowing everything beyond the reach of my headlights. I had driven this stretch of road countless times, but tonight there was something off. The kind of quiet that presses down on you, making you feel like you're being watched. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 12:14 a.m. I should have been home by now, but I felt like I'd been driving forever. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the trees on either side looming over me like dark, twisted figures. I turned down the radio to break the silence, thinking maybe some music would help shake off this weird feeling. But it didn't. Instead, the quiet seemed to amplify the steady thrum of my heart in my ears. Suddenly, I noticed something up ahead, a shape on the side of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a car, pulled over with its hazard lights blinking. The car's front end was partially obscured by the tree line, and its door was slightly ajar. I slowed down, considering stopping to help, but something stopped me. There was no one standing near the car, no sign of movement at all. Just the blinking lights, cutting through the night like a warning. I kept driving, my grip tightening on the wheel. Maybe they'd already called for help. Maybe they were inside the car, waiting for someone. But as I drove past, I glanced in my rearview mirror and caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood by the car, now a tall, shadowy silhouette. They hadn't been there a moment ago. I was sure of it. I stared at the figure in the mirror for a heartbeat too long, and when I looked back at the road, something darted in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I skidded to a stop. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat frozen, trying to catch my breath. Had I hit something? I couldn't be sure. The road ahead was empty again, but I swore I'd seen someone run across just seconds ago. I turned on my high beams and scanned the area. The light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and the empty road. No movement, no sign of anyone or anything. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a deer, I told myself, but I knew that wasn't true. Whatever it was, it had been too tall, too human-shaped. I took a deep breath and pressed the gas pedal, inching forward. The road felt narrower now, the darkness closing in on me. I just wanted to get home, to put this night behind me. But as I continued driving, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a shadow darting between the trees, a flash of movement just outside the reach of my headlights. My heart raced as I pressed down harder on the gas, desperate to outrun whatever was out there. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the familiar glow of streetlights in the distance. Relief washed over me as I turned onto my street, the comforting sight of my neighborhood bringing me back to reality. I pulled into my driveway and cut the engine, sitting in silence for a moment. My hands were shaking. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing at the end of my driveway. But there was nothing, just the empty street and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I got out of the car, locking the doors behind me as I hurried inside. The warmth of my house was a welcome relief, but as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the lingering unease. The road, the car, the figure, it all felt too real to just brush off. To this day, I still avoid driving that stretch of road at night. I can't explain what happened that night, and maybe I never will. But one thing is for sure, I'll never forget the feeling of being watched by something out there in the darkness. Something I never want to encounter again. Driving at night has never bothered me. The empty roads and calm of darkness always had a certain appeal, but that night, something shifted. It was an ordinary drive back home, about an hour outside of the city, along a quiet, rural highway. The kind where the only light comes from your own headlights, and the only sound is the hum of your tires on the asphalt. The first half of the drive was uneventful. I kept my eyes on the road, half listening to the soft music playing from the radio. There were no other cars in sight, which was typical for this area so late at night. But as the miles ticked by, I began to feel a strange sense of unease. It started small, just a faint prickle at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Then, about 30 minutes into the drive, I saw something up ahead. It was just a faint silhouette at first, barely visible in the distance. I slowed down instinctively, trying to make out what it was. As I got closer, I realized it was a car, pulled over to the side of the road with its hazard lights blinking. I used my car to a stop a few feet away. The car looked old, maybe from the late 90s, with a dull, rusty exterior. Its driver's side door was open, but there was no one inside. I scanned the area, but the road was deserted, and the trees lining the highway cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to move in the corner of my vision. I considered getting out to check if anyone needed help, but something stopped me. A heavy, uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. Why would someone leave their car like this in the middle of nowhere? It didn't feel right. I honked my horn a few times, hoping to alert whoever was nearby, but there was no response, just the rhythmic flashing of the hazard lights, illuminating the dark, empty road. I told myself to drive on, that it wasn't my problem, but as I was about to press the gas pedal, something caught my eye, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. I could barely make it out through the darkness, but there was definitely someone there, half hidden in the shadows. For a moment, we just stared at each other, me, sitting in my car, and that dark figure standing among the trees. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. The way they stood so still, so quiet, it didn't feel natural. It was as if they were waiting. Without thinking, I floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the scene. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The car and the figure quickly disappeared into the darkness, but the sense of dread lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, that whatever was out there had noticed me and wasn't going to let me go so easily. I drove faster than I ever had before, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long, every tree seemed to loom too tall. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the fear that something was still out there, watching me, waiting for me to stop. About 10 minutes later, I saw the comforting glow of streetlights in the distance. Relief washed over me as I neared the outskirts of a small town. The empty road gave way to the occasional passing car, and the eerie quiet of the woods was replaced by the familiar sounds of civilization. I pulled into a gas station, needing a moment to collect myself. I sat in my car, taking deep breaths and trying to calm my racing heart. The fluorescent lights of the station felt like a sanctuary after the darkness of the highway. I never did find out who or what was standing in those trees that night. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. The memory of that dark figure and the overwhelming sense of dread that came with it still haunts me. Even now, whenever I find myself driving at night, I can't help but glance into the shadows, half expecting to see something or someone waiting for me. The road stretched out before me, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dark countryside. It was a typical late-night drive, something I had done many times before, but that night felt different. The air was thick with an uneasy stillness that crept into the car through the open windows. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. It was nearly 2 a.m., and I was heading home after visiting some friends in a neighboring town. The road was empty, the kind of isolation that usually made me feel at ease. But tonight, something felt off. The darkness seemed heavier, and the faint glow of my headlights only illuminated the emptiness around me. I clicked on the radio to break the silence, but nothing came through, just static. I flipped through the stations, hoping to catch something, anything, but the airwaves were dead. I shut it off, annoyed by the crackling noise, and focused on the road. That's when I saw a figure standing by the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, but as I got closer, something about it felt wrong. The figure was tall, too tall, with unnaturally long limbs that hung at odd angles. I slowed down, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of its face. Or rather, the lack of one. It had no features, just a smooth, pale surface where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. I gasped and pressed down on the accelerator, my car speeding past the figure. I didn't dare look back. My pulse raced as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by something I didn't notice. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the image of that faceless figure stayed with me. I forced myself to calm down. The road was still empty, and there was no reason to be afraid. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, right? I kept driving, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Then, up ahead, I saw it again. Another figure, standing by the side of the road. My stomach dropped. This one looked identical to the first, tall, gangly, and faceless. I slowed down, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. As I passed, I forced myself to look straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact with whatever that thing was. I sped up again, this time not caring how fast I was going. The eerie quiet of the road had transformed into something sinister, and all I wanted was to be as far away from those figures as possible. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of them standing in the middle of the road behind me. But there was nothing, just darkness. I must have driven for another 20 minutes, my hands shaking on the wheel, before I saw it for the third time. It stood in the middle of the road this time, directly in my path. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car came to a sudden halt. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, blocking the road, its featureless face pointed in my direction. My heart pounded in my ears, and for a moment, I considered turning the car around and driving back the way I came, but something told me that wouldn't help. Somehow, they would still be there, waiting for me. Summoning every bit of courage I had, I honked the horn, hoping the figure would move. But it remained motionless. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I inched the car forward, the headlights casting long shadows on the road. When I was just a few feet away, the figure finally moved, slowly stepping to the side and letting me pass. I didn't hesitate. I floored the gas pedal and sped past it, not daring to look back. My heart didn't stop racing until I saw the lights of my town in the distance. Only then did I feel the tension in my chest begin to ease. I made it home safely that night, but the memory of those faceless figures has never left me. Every time I drive down a dark, empty road, I can't help but glance at the side, half expecting to see one of them standing there, waiting for me to pass by again. The headlights of my car cut through the pitch-black night as I drove down the empty stretch of Highway 15, heading home from a late meeting. The moon was barely visible, hidden behind thick, rolling clouds, and the road felt eerily isolated. It was the kind of night that made you question the safety of being alone in the middle of nowhere. I'd driven this route dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the oppressive quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost too heavy. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thumping of the tires against the road. I had the radio off. Any background noise seemed out of place. As I rounded a bend, I saw something in the distance, an old car parked on the shoulder. Its headlights were off, but the car was otherwise in good condition, which struck me as odd. In the middle of nowhere, why would anyone stop here? I slowed down, my curiosity piqued. The car had no one around it, and there were no other vehicles in sight. I contemplated stopping to check if anyone needed help, but something held me back. It felt like an instinctive hesitation, a sense that something wasn't right. I reluctantly drove past, glancing in my rearview mirror to see if the car had a driver or any sign of movement. There was nothing. It just sat there, a dark silhouette against the night. About 15 minutes later, I saw the same car again, this time parked further down the road in a different spot. My stomach churned. It was too coincidental. I slowed to a crawl, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of life. Still nothing, no movement, no lights, just the silent, unnerving presence of the vehicle. Then, as if sensing my growing anxiety, the temperature inside the car dropped noticeably. I could see my breath misting in the air. It was unsettling, but I tried to dismiss it as a quirk of the car's climate control system. I picked up speed, eager to leave the strange encounter behind. Just when I thought the incident was over, my headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. The figure was obscured by the darkness, but it was clear they were wearing a dark, hooded cloak. I couldn't make out any facial features. I honked the horn repeatedly, but the figure remained motionless. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I fought to steady my breathing. The figure's silence was deafening. I tried to shift the car into reverse, but before I could, the figure slowly moved to the side, revealing a narrow gap just wide enough to pass. As I inched forward, The figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from view. I didn't look back, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I drove as fast as I could, adrenaline pumping through my veins, until I reached the nearest town. I stopped at a gas station and recounted the story to the attendant, who looked at me with a mixture of skepticism and concern. He said that sometimes, people playing pranks or in need of help would get desperate and try to make themselves seem more mysterious or threatening than they really were. Though I tried to calm myself with his explanation, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. There was something undeniably unsettling about the whole experience, the sense of being watched, the sudden drop in temperature, the silent figure. It was as if the night itself was conspiring to test my nerves. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but the eerie memory stayed with me. Every time I drive that route now, I find myself scanning the darkened road, half expecting to see the mysterious car or figure appear again. Though I know logically that it was likely just a combination of strange circumstances and overactive imagination, the fear of the unknown continues to haunt me. I had been driving for hours. The road stretched out endlessly under the moonlit sky. It was well past midnight, and the only company I had was the monotonous hum of the engine and the occasional flash of headlights from rare passing cars. I was heading home from a late shift at work, taking the quiet country route I preferred for its lack of traffic. The night was unusually still. The kind of stillness that presses against your ears, making you acutely aware of every creak and groan of the car. As I drove along the winding road, I noticed something peculiar, a flickering light in the distance, almost like a campfire or a lantern. Though there were no campsites or houses around, curiosity got the better of me. I slowed down and turned off my radio, trying to get a better look. The light was dim but seemed to hover in the distance, sometimes obscured by trees. As I drew closer, I saw that it was coming from an old, abandoned service station on the side of the road. I'd passed this place many times and it had always been dark and empty. My heart pounded a bit faster as I approached. The station had been out of use for years, its pumps long rusted and its building dilapidated. Tonight, however, it was different. A single light was swinging from a chain, casting eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. The air felt colder as I drove closer, and I noticed that the flickering light was accompanied by an odd, rhythmic sound, a faint thumping or tapping that seemed to resonate through the night. I stopped the car and got out, my breath visible in the chilly air. The tapping sound grew louder as I approached the service station. The light swung back and forth, its eerie glow illuminating the entrance. I called out, "Hello, is anyone here?" The only answer was the persistent tapping and the faint, rhythmic creaking of the swinging light. My instincts told me to get back in the car and drive away, but I felt compelled to investigate. I walked closer, trying to peer through the grimy windows of the service station. To my surprise, I saw a figure moving inside, a shadowy silhouette, pacing back and forth. My initial thought was that it was someone in distress, so I knocked on the door and shouted again. The figure stopped and seemed to be looking directly at me, though the window was too dirty to see clearly. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, and the light flickered out. The service station was plunged into darkness. I stood there, heart racing, trying to make out any movement inside. The figure was gone. I waited for a few minutes, hoping to see some sign of life or hear a response. Nothing happened. The cold began to seep into my bones, and the silence grew even more oppressive. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I turned and hurried back to my car, every nerve on edge. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the light flickering back on, but the figure was no longer visible. When I reached home, I told my friends about the strange encounter. They all agreed it was probably just someone messing around or a malfunctioning light. Still, the experience left me shaken. It was as if the service station was playing a cruel trick on me, using the flickering light and mysterious figure to unsettle me. Even now, I avoid that stretch of road at night. The image of the swinging light and the dark figure remains vivid in my mind. Though nothing bad happened and everyone was safe, the encounter serves as a chilling reminder of how the unknown can stir our deepest fears, making the ordinary seem terrifyingly sinister. It was a frigid night in late November when I drove home from a work conference. The journey was long, stretching over desolate roads that wound through forests and past eerie, abandoned farms. I'd taken this route many times before, but something felt off that evening, like the air was thicker with unease. I was just past midnight, my car's headlights cutting through the dense darkness. I was about an hour from home when I noticed a flickering light up ahead. At first, I thought it was just a reflection or some trick of the road, but as I got closer, the light became more distinct. It was a single, dim glow, barely visible through the trees that lined the road. Curiosity tugged at me. I slowed down and pulled over, turning off the engine. The light was coming from a small, dilapidated house nestled off the road. Its windows were dark, but the glow seemed to emanate from the doorway. I decided to investigate, hoping to see if someone needed help or if there was a logical explanation. I stepped out into the biting cold and approached the house. The light, which had been swaying gently, now seemed to be steady. It cast long and settling shadows on the snow-covered ground. As I neared the door, I could hear faint music, an old-fashioned tune that seemed oddly out of place. My instinct screamed to turn back, but I was compelled by a mix of curiosity and concern. I reached the front porch and knocked on the door. The music stopped abruptly, and the light went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, and I could feel my heart pound in my chest. I waited a few moments, but no one answered. I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" Silence. I tried the door handle. It was surprisingly warm, which was odd considering the cold outside. I pushed the door open slightly and peered inside. The hallway was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The place had an unsettling stillness. Just then, I heard a creak behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, stronger than anything I'd experienced before. I didn't want to be in that place a moment longer. I turned and hurried back to my car, glancing over my shoulder as I went. The door to the house had swung shut on its own, and the light inside flickered back on. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the house, its light still glowing softly in the distance. When I finally reached home, I told my friends about the experience. They were intrigued but thought it was just an old, abandoned place with a faulty light. The next day, I looked up the house online, hoping for some rational explanation. To my surprise, the house was listed as a long-forgotten property with no recent activity. No one had lived there for years. Even now, I avoid driving that stretch of road at night. The image of the flickering light and the eerie silence lingers in my mind. While nothing bad happened and everyone was safe, the encounter left a mark on me, a reminder of how the ordinary can turn unnervingly strange when you least expect it.